Greetings, my name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post, and I'm a specialist in Russian foreign policy. And if you're interested in such things, please like and subscribe as we discuss the war, defense news, intelligence, and security of the United States, as well as Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. So what's going to happen today? Today is potentially a major day in the history of the war against Ukraine waged by Russia. There will be a talk between Vladimir Putin and the U.S. President Donald Trump at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. So either they will reach some sort of an agreement to achieve a ceasefire, which would be a major turn of events in the war, or they won't. Today will just be a political stunt, and nothing really happens. So what's more likely to occur? Well, let's look at both options. Now, let's remember, though the call is supposed to start at 10 a.m., during Donald Trump's first call with Putin during his second administration, just a couple months ago, Putin showed up over an hour late. He was on a stage in St. Petersburg and said he was simply busy and that Trump would have to wait. So it shows you how little Putin gives a damn about Trump's time. But neither here nor there, potentially there is the possibility that today will not be just an ordinary phone call. In fact, it become a phone call that could end the war that has lasted for over 3 years and has killed well over 400,000 people. And if it fails, let's imagine it is just a political stunt and nothing comes from it. Well, they could also have dire consequences. And they could be a signal of much larger things to come that we've not yet discussed, but we could see in the imminent future. But let's look at first what's going to happen today. So at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the U.S. President will call the Russian president. It's going to be 5 p.m. Moscow time. And President Putin is planning on speaking with Trump to discuss exactly what it is that they have an agreement, where they can find a common language, and what is acceptable to the Russian side in order to reach a ceasefire. Now, how likely is that is something that's left to a lot of interpretation. Trump, after he finishes his phone call with the Russian president, who I should refer to as the Russian dictator, will then have a phone call with President Zelenskyy of Ukraine to discuss exactly what came of the call, what expectations were set, and what the Russians said. Thereafter, it's expected that Donald Trump will brief NATO as well as European Union leaders on this. And as you know, they're currently all working together in a coordinated push to have a 30-day ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. The countries that have taken the lead in that has been in the news a great deal recently is France, Germany, the UK, and Italy. Now, as you recall, just a couple weeks ago, the leaders of France, Germany, and the UK, as well as Poland, traveled to Kiev to express their strong support for Ukraine and to say that if Putin did not get serious, then they were going to be putting on serious sanctions. The sanctions that the U.S., as well as the sanctions that the Europeans are looking at right now, in fact, are much stiffer than what Russia is currently facing. And it is hoped that it will entice Russia to make the right decision and to try to work on ending this war. Now, there has been some very unsettling or negative news coming out of Germany recently. The new chancellor, Merz, who everybody had thought would be much better than Scholz, the old chancellor, who was very fearful of conflict with Russia, that Merz is saying that he will not give Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians, despite asking for them for years. He's in fact not even going to train the Ukrainians on them because he's trying to make some sort of a deal with the Social Democrats back in his own country. But that's neither here nor there. Back to the official phone call today. The Russians have two major demands, and they're not really shifting on them. One is that the Ukrainians withdraw totally from Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Now, all of those areas are partially occupied. Lugansk is occupied over 98%. In the case of the other ones, it's about 70-something percent. And the Russians don't even mention Crimea, but that's sort of expected, that the Ukrainians will not try to get back Crimea, which has been illegally occupied and annexed by Russia in 2014. But the other thing that Russia is seeking is that Ukraine will opt out of ever joining NATO. That's very important for Putin. Now, I think it's sort of absurd when you consider this. The reason that Ukraine wants to join NATO is to prevent Russia from invading, and the Russians are saying, but we promise we won't invade, so they don't have to join NATO. It's just circular logic that makes no sense. But typical of Russia, this is all a game. They're not seeking peace. Even Peskov, who's a spokesman for the Kremlin, has said that the Russian president will listen respectfully, has referred to this as a symbolic phone call, so it doesn't seem like the Russians are planning on a lot actually coming of it. At the same time, then why even have the phone call? What's the point of all this time invested in something that nothing's going to happen, and it will achieve likely very little, if anything? First, Donald Trump needs a win. Right now, he needs something to show. Let's look at just what's happened in the last few hours, last few days. Russia and Ukraine had meetings in Istanbul, the first diplomatic meeting since 2022. They agreed to a prisoner exchange, which was very good. They exchanged a ton of Russian prisoners for a ton of Ukrainian prisoners, and that was probably the high point. Everything else sort of failed. There was no agreement as far as the borders, nor for the ceasefire, and there's certainly no resolution whatsoever about Crimea or NATO or the 4 occupied territories outside of Crimea. Now, the talks, which only lasted about 90 minutes despite a long build-up to them, were something that the Turkish were hosting these, the Turkish president referred to as the West of Moscow playing games with people's lives, and expressed dissatisfaction with the way that both sides acted during the talks. Now, 48 hours later, Russia then launched its largest drone and missile assault on Ukraine since the beginning of the war. So we see very quickly Russia goes through the show, the act of wanting peace, going to talks, but at the end of the day, when they don't work out, because Russia doesn't want them to work out, Russia just continues to kill more civilians. And a lot of people do ask, is it true that Russia is actually trying to kill civilians and not just strike military targets? Yes, they're trying to kill civilians. And my argument for why that is actually quite simple. Ukraine has state-of-the-art air defense, namely American Patriot missiles. Those are stationed, no surprise, at every location that would have highly sensitive information or persons working. You can imagine where those would be in order to protect the security of the government. What is not left nearly as well protected then is the rest of civilian infrastructure. Keep in mind, it's very hard to cover the largest country in Europe with enough missile defense. So Russia is a much easier target trying to strike hospitals or apartment buildings than it does trying to strike the head of the military, for instance. So yes, Russia is intentionally trying to kill civilians as a means of getting the Ukrainians to say that the war is not worth it and to give up. Now, these talks going ahead, there is some idea that Russia might themselves also want to see some sort of an end in the near term. Keep in mind, every week over 5,000 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers are dying. The proportion of Russians dying is about 2 to 1, a little bit less, according to open source information. In the city of Kharkiv, Ukraine, which is the second largest city in Ukraine, the Russians have killed over 1,000 civilians just in the past few weeks. So Ukraine is suffering a lot right now. They definitely want to see this war end. But it's really in the Russians' hands. They are the aggressors. And keep in mind, Russia's not acting alone. Russians using North Korean soldiers, North Korean artillery, Iranian drones, Chinese satellites, and they are having what we could truly define as a global war that they are waging against Ukraine. Meanwhile, since the U.S. government has cut off support for Ukraine, Ukraine is running out of missile defense. And it's something that it desperately needs is more air defense. So though the U.S. population right now is divided and unsure if it wants to give more aid to Ukraine, you can be sure it's costing lives. And that's why today's call actually ultimately will matter, is that for the Russians, they're a lot less concerned about the loss of lives, but they are very concerned about the fact that they are running out of goods that they need to wage the war. The Ukrainians are sick of the loss of bloodshed, or the continuing bloodshed. And it's something that even Donald Trump has continued to refer to as stopping the bloodshed. Unfortunately, not everybody's been so convinced. We see that the U.S. Congress has not been convinced of that, and we see that Donald Trump himself has said a lot of things that would indicate that he doesn't really believe in supporting Ukraine or in the future of NATO, for that matter. So it's very unclear what the White House's position is or what it will become, but it doesn't look favorable right now. Now, the administration itself of Donald Trump is sort of confused. You've seen in the last couple of weeks, Marco Rubio was making his trips, J.D. Vance is making his trips, both, by the way, who are in the Vatican right now, meeting with the Pope after he had his first Mass after he's installed. Keep in mind, the blood of innocents is being spilt, and Rubio and Vance, the pious Catholics, are there enjoying their vacation. But it's not just the Americans. It's also the Europeans. There's Macron, there's Merz, there's Sunak, there's Meloni, and all four of them are pushing and pressing for Putin to sign up for an unconditional ceasefire. They wanted to see this happen with no territorial concessions and no other clear agreements but the ceasefire. Let's start with the ceasefire and let's get further. Now, other countries are more cautious. Poland and the Baltic states have been issuing warnings that Russia could very well use the ceasefire to simply regroup. Other countries in Europe, such as Hungary under Orban or Slovakia, have been, in fact, pro-Russian, I would argue. In fact, the leader of Slovakia traveled recently to Moscow for the May 9th Victory Day parade. So it shows exactly where they are. They're not trying to help out here. So Trump, unfortunately, is aligned more with that branch of Europe than he is with the centrist or pro-defense branch of Europe, the mainstream branch of Europe. So this is not a U.S.-Russia moment. We should say that this is a broader U.S., Europe, our allies globally, and Russia and its allies globally, China, Iran, and North Korea. Because all of this comes in the interplay. We're not dealing with Russia as an isolated state. We're dealing with all this in play. And that's why what happens ultimately in this phone call or after this phone call, the next one, whatever it is, they finally reach some sort of agreement, is something that will have global implications. That'll affect Asia, which thereby will affect or empower China if this works out well for Russia, which undoubtedly would be a very bad sign for Taiwan. And would be something that people in obviously Australia, as well as New Zealand, will be very concerned by and should be concerned by. That's something I'll be talking about in a new video soon. But globally, what is happening in this war is not local. It's not simply a European war. This is truly a global war, though we don't call it that. So today, it's not just another Monday morning phone call, one more thing on the to-do list to check off the box on. It's a moment that could truly shift what is occurring in the war and deepen the divides. Or it could be a moment that we actually reach some sort of a peace or get close to one. If you enjoyed this video, I ask you please like and subscribe. It costs you nothing, but helps me greatly. And after the talks today, I plan on giving another talk, making another video to discuss what actually came of these. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for supporting Ukraine.